The blood in the yard. The night was supposed to be uneventful. Blackridge Maximum Security Prison, locked tight under a blanket of mist, usually came alive at dawn with the clatter of gates and the barking of guards. But on that night, in the shadow of its 40-foot walls, the quiet was pierced by a sound that made every guard stiffen. A whistle, followed by the sharp crackle of radios and then the shrill cry of alarms. Floodlights snapped on across the compound. Towers lit up like watchful eyes, illuminating the yard below in a cold, bluish glare. It was there, under the merciless light, that the body lay sprawled. Gravel pressed into his cheek, blood pooling beneath his throat, his eyes wide open as if still locked in the final second of disbelief. His name was Mateo Cruz. To the inmates, he had been a survivor, a man who had walked through cartel wars, DA indictments, and countless assassination attempts. To his enemies, he was a traitor, a man whose loyalty could be bought and sold. And to the guards, he was just another body in a prison already known as the deadliest cage on earth. But Cruz's death didn't look like a typical prison killing. His throat had been opened with a single razor-sharp cut, precise and clean. No wild shiv slash, no desperate stabbing frenzy. Whoever killed him had been calm, calculated, and close. Detective Laura Jensen arrived minutes after the scene was secured, her badge still clipped to her civilian jacket. She'd been pulled from her bed by the call. Possible homicide inside Blackridge, unusual circumstances. Warden requests external oversight. That phrase, unusual circumstances, was enough to make her uneasy. She crouched by the body, her breath fogging in the cold night. Cruz's right hand was balled into a tight fist. Carefully she pried it open. Inside, slick with blood, was a torn scrap of fabric. At first glance, it seemed like nothing, a shred of black cloth. But the texture told her otherwise. It wasn't prison garb. It was thick, heavy, stitched. It was a piece of a guard's uniform. Jensen looked up at the watchtowers. Guards stood rigid, rifles slung across their chests, eyes scanning the yard as though they hadn't just failed in the one job they swore to uphold, keeping order. Her gut twisted. She had seen cover-ups before, but this was different. A man had been murdered under floodlights, in the most fortified prison in the hemisphere, and not a single camera caught it. The warden, Harold King, arrived soon after. Tall, iron-jawed, his presence seemed to silence even the air. "Detective," he said coldly, "you'll find Cruz was a marked man. He had enemies in every block. Someone finally got to him. Or someone let them," Jensen replied evenly, holding up the scrap of cloth. King's eyes flickered for a split second, just enough for her to know she'd hit a nerve. Then he smiled thinly. "Detective, this place houses the worst of the worst. Cruz was cartel. He killed men without blinking. You can't seriously believe one of my staff would risk everything to silence him. But she did." Back in the processing office, Jensen pored over Cruz's file. His crimes read like a roadmap of violence. Cocaine routes from Colombia to Miami, disappearances of rivals in Texas, shootouts in Arizona. Yet buried at the bottom of the file was something curious, a notation made only weeks earlier. Inmate requesting meeting with federal prosecutors. Claims knowledge of trafficking pipeline inside prison. So Cruz hadn't just been another inmate. He had been ready to talk. And now he was dead. The prison buzzed with rumor the next morning. Inmates shuffled through breakfast with lowered eyes, whispers following every tray that slid across the counter. Someone scrawled in ketchup on the cafeteria wall, "Snitches get buried." The message was crude but effective. Fear spread faster than food. Jensen walked the tiers, her gaze sweeping the cells. Most men wouldn't meet her eyes. But one did. Darnell Little D. Hughes, Cruz's cellmate, a wiry man with jittery hands and a scar that carved across his jawline. When she pulled him into the interview room, he sat with his knee bouncing uncontrollably. "Cruz was nervous the past week," Hughes muttered, eyes flicking toward the surveillance camera in the corner. "Said he had a deal lined up. Said once he spoke, he'd be walking out free." "What kind of deal?" Jensen pressed. Hughes leaned closer, his voice dropping. "He told me it wasn't the inmates he was afraid of. He said, it's the ones with keys." The words hit Jensen like a weight. Guards. The very people sworn to keep order. That night, Jensen reviewed security footage of the yard. Dozens of angles, all grainy, all routine. But frame by frame, she noticed one anomaly. A guard, Officer Mark Bennett, shifting his patrol route minutes before Cruz collapsed. For 30 seconds, the cameras lost direct sight of Cruz. 30 seconds was all it took. She brought Bennett in. His uniform was crisp, his expression bored, as though he'd been through this dance 100 times. "You were out of position," Jensen said, sliding the footage across the table. Bennett smirked. You think I killed him? Detective, this is Blackridge. If I wanted him dead, you wouldn't have a body to examine. You'd have nothing at all. His arrogance curdled her stomach. But arrogance often hid fear. Later, as she sifted through Cruz's personal belongings, a discovery made her pause. Among the letters, commissary slips, and worn Bible, she found a folded scrap of paper hidden in the book's lining. In shaky handwriting it read, "They're bringing them in through the kitchen. The boss wears a badge. If I don't make it out, check the basement freezer." The words were cryptic, chilling. The kitchen. The basement. A boss with a badge. When Jensen asked Warden King for access to the basement, his answer was immediate. Absolutely not. Food storage only. Nothing to see. The speed of his refusal only sharpened her suspicion. 2 nights later, Jensen returned under the pretense of a routine inspection. Ramirez, a young officer she trusted, followed her down the concrete steps into the bowels of Blackridge. The air grew colder, heavier, until they reached the steel door of the basement freezer. Jensen's hands trembled slightly as she forced the lock. The hinges groaned. Inside, the cold hit like a wall. Stacks of meat and vegetables lined the shelves, frost creeping up the edges. But in the far corner, covered by a tarp, was something that didn't belong. A wooden crate. Military grade. Across the top, in stark black stenciling, were the words, "Property of the U.S. Department of Defense." Ramirez's breath caught. What the hell is this? Jensen reached out, her gloved hand brushing the frozen surface. Inside, she knew, lay the answer to Cruz's murder. But before she could open it, the cold silence was broken by the unmistakable sound of a gun cocking behind her. "Step away from the crate," a voice growled. Jensen froze. She didn't need to turn around to know who it was. Officer Bennett. Whispers of betrayal. The metallic click of the gun hammer was louder than Jensen expected. It cut through the frozen air, sharp enough to make Ramirez's breath hitch beside her. Detective Laura Jensen didn't move. She kept her eyes fixed on the crate stenciled with those damning words, "Property of the U.S. Department of Defense." "Step away," Officer Bennett said, his voice flat, steady, and soaked in contempt. "You've seen too much already. Open that crate and you'll never make it out of here." Jensen raised her hands slowly. "So it was you," she said quietly. "You silenced Cruz because he knew." Bennett chuckled, a low, humorless sound. Cruz was an idiot. He thought he could play both sides, sell out the people protecting him. He forgot what happens to men who betray the hand that feeds them. "Protecting him?" Jensen asked, stalling, keeping her voice calm. "Or protecting yourself?" For a split second, his jaw tightened. She'd struck a nerve. But before he could respond, the prison itself seemed to shudder. Alarms wailed, echoing through the concrete walls. Red emergency lights strobed in the hallway beyond the freezer door. The intercom blared, "Code Black. Code Black in cell block D. All units respond." The riot had begun. The timing was almost too perfect. Bennett cursed under his breath, glancing toward the sound. In that moment of hesitation, Jensen acted. She swung her elbow back, connecting hard with his forearm. The gun discharged, the shot deafening in the confined freezer. A spray of frost burst from a punctured pipe. Ramirez lunged, grappling with Bennett, both men sliding across the icy floor. Jensen grabbed a crowbar leaning against the shelf and drove it against Bennett's wrist. The gun clattered to the ground, spinning across the concrete. She scooped it up, her hands shaking but steady enough to aim. "Don't move," she snapped. Bennett leaned against a crate, blood on his lip, eyes gleaming with something between rage and amusement. "You think pointing that at me will change anything? Look around, detective. The prison's already gone. You're not stopping it. You're just another piece in the machine." The freezer door slammed open. A flood of footsteps thundered in, guards, led by Warden Harold King himself. His face was grim, his pistol raised. Behind him, more officers spilled into the freezer, weapons at the ready. "What the hell is going on here?" King barked. His eyes swept the scene. Bennett bleeding, Jensen holding the gun, Ramirez pale with fear, and the half-uncovered military crate. Jensen didn't lower her weapon. "This," she said, nodding at the crate, "is why Cruz died. He was going to expose this operation. Weapons smuggled through your prison with the help of your staff. Your staff, Warden." King's eyes flicked to the crate. For just a moment, his mask cracked. Surprise, then recognition, then cold calculation. But when he spoke, his tone was iron. "Detective, you're overstepping. That crate is evidence of an ongoing federal matter. Classified. You had no clearance to touch it. Classified. Jensen shot back. Or covered up? The guards raised their rifles. Ramirez stiffened, whispering, "Laura, what do we do?" King's lips curled into a thin smile. "Put the gun down, detective. You're on my ground now." For one agonizing second, Jensen weighed her options. Shoot and risk dying in a storm of bullets, or comply and watch the truth get buried again. But before either choice could land, a deep, guttural roar erupted from the hallway. The sound of hundreds of voices screaming, boots pounding against concrete, iron doors slamming open. The riot was no longer contained to one block, it was spreading like fire. "Secure the crate," King barked to his men. But his order came too late. The first wave of inmates crashed into the corridor, armed with pipes, sharpened metal, and sheer desperation. A massive figure at the front, a tattooed giant known only as Reaper, spotted the open freezer and bellowed, "Weapons! They got weapons in here." The guards pivoted, rifles up, unleashing a hail of gunfire down the hall. Bullets cracked against walls, sparks flying. But the inmates didn't stop. They surged forward, overwhelming the entryway. Chaos detonated. Bennett lunged in the distraction, slamming into Jensen. The pistol fired, the shot grazing his shoulder. He howled in pain but didn't stop, his fist connecting with her jaw, knocking her back against the crate. Ramirez tackled him again, desperate, but Bennett was stronger, meaner. The freezer became a war zone. Guards and inmates collided in the doorway, fists and blades against rifles. Blood sprayed across the frosted walls. A body fell against the crate, sliding lifeless to the ground. Through the chaos, Jensen saw something that froze her blood colder than the freezer air. One of the inmates, his arms sleeved with ink, face twisted in glee, was hauling a rifle from the open crate. Another followed, grabbing ammunition boxes. Within seconds, the weapons meant to be hidden had fallen into the hands of the very men this prison was supposed to contain. And it was just the beginning. Jensen's heart pounded. If those weapons spread through the blocks, Blackridge wouldn't be a riot. It would be a battlefield. She forced herself up, pistol in hand, jaw throbbing from Bennett's punch. He was gone, slipped into the chaos like a shadow, blood trailing in his wake. Ramirez staggered toward her, clutching his side where a blade had grazed him. "Detective, we can't stay here." He was right. Already, the freezer was choking with bodies, the clash of steel and gunfire deafening. Guards fell. Inmates surged. And in the middle of it all, the warden had vanished. Jensen grabbed Ramirez, dragging him out a side door into the corridor beyond. The hallway was no better. Lights flickering, smoke curling, alarms screaming overhead. Men in orange jumpsuits swarmed, some laughing, some screaming, all drunk on sudden freedom. The prison had become hell. And as Jensen pulled Ramirez through the smoke, she realized with a sinking certainty. Cruz's murder had been the spark. But what had ignited tonight would burn far beyond Blackridge's walls.